Okay. Hello, my name is Stupegia, and today is June 29th, and I'll be interviewing my grandfather, Gerald M at the LaSalle Public Library. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress through the LaSalle Public Library's Next Generation. So, Gerald, where were you born?
I was born in Kewanee, Illinois.
Alright. When were you born?
August 4th, 1943.
Alright. Do you have any siblings?
Any what?
Siblings.
Yeah, I got a sister, Joyce, and a brother, Tom, and then I got two stepsisters.
Alright. Did any of your siblings serve?
My brother did. Tom served in the Army.
Okay. And did you enlist, or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Alright. How old were you when you enlisted?
Just a minute, I gotta think about that for a second. I think I was 18 years old when I enlisted.
Alright. So what branch did you serve in?
The United States Air Force.
Right. Did you have any specialized training of any kind?
Yes, sir. I was a jet engine mechanic.
Alright.
I went to school down here at Rantoul. That's where jet engine school was at that time. And I graduated from there, and then I was shipped to Dover.
Alright. Do you recall what year you went to Dover, the Dover Air Force Base?
Yes. I got out of tech school. I started at tech school down there in about the middle of October in 1962, and I left there the middle of January of 63. I took a 30-day leave and I got out to Dover in February of 1962.
Alright. Let me see. How did your family react when you enlisted?
Oh, they thought it was all right.
Alright. Okay, going back to training, do you remember what any of your instructors were like?
Sure I do. You mean basic training?
Yeah.
Yeah, I took basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. And I had my TI training instructor was Sergeant Fell, and he was a staff sergeant, and he was kind of a rough customer at first until we all got indoctrinated. You've seen in the movies where they treat these new troops, you know, they run them through the mill.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they did with us too. Now, basic training back then was a lot tougher and longer than it is now. I think now they only go 8 weeks. I was down there, if I remember right, 16 weeks. And we got to do all the goody stuff. We went and played war games and went out in the field. I carried a 50 caliber machine gun around on my back for 2 or 3 days out there once. I was the only one big enough to hack it.
Alright. How did you adapt to the military lifestyle?
Oh, I adapted all right to it. By the time I got out of tech school, I was pretty well orientated. And then after, say, 2 or 3 months at Dover, I was definitely, because I was working on a crew then. We had our own C-124. See, I was originally, I went to the 133 outfit because it was a jet engine airplane. That's what I was supposed to be working on, see. But I'll show you what a C-124 looks like. This particular airplane is the one that's in the Air Force Museum.
Yeah.
That used to be a Dover airplane. I worked on that airplane. In fact, the guy who lived across the hall from me was the assistant crew chief on that airplane. That's the exact one. You can go to Dayton, Ohio and see that dude. Anyway, I was on a crew on one of these. I got shipped up there because we had 54 of them big mothers there. And they only had 25 133s, so we were kind of expendable. And I spent a year and a half up there working on Old Shaky. That was her nickname, Old Shaky. And it was a heck of a good airplane.
Alright. So you served in the San Antonio and Dover. Were there any other places you served at in the Air Force?
You mean different places I went?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Oh, I went to Travis Air Force Base. I've been to Hickam over in Hawaii. Been to a couple, 3 places in Vietnam. Philippines, Clark Field in the Philippines, which I don't think we no longer go in there. Guam, Wake Island. Going the other way, we went to Adana and Incirlik, Turkey. We went to Frankfurt in Maine in Germany. We went to Mendenhall in England. What the heck was the name of that big base up in Scotland up there? We used to go in there too, pretty regular. We got around. See, we were in, when I first went to Dover, what later became the Military Airlift Command was called MATS, Military Air Transport Service. I was about my second year, halfway through the second year, that would have been in '64, they switched the name of it from MATS to the Military Airlift Command. Okay, when you were in that, see, you hauled stuff for everybody. We hauled cargo for the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, you name it. We even hauled stuff when they built the Alaskan pipeline. We hauled those big units up there for them. The C-5 did that, which was the last one I worked on.
Alright. What was it like getting to...
That's the C-5, folks, if you want to. I'll show you a real good picture of this, too. She is a big mother. You can't park it on a football field, that's so big. No, it's true, you can't. That's what it looks like in flight, guys.
Okay. Okay, so...
That's a C-5A. We got our first one of them, I think, was in 1969 at Dover.
Alright. So, what was it like getting to travel across the world for the Air Force and everything?
Oh, it was probably the best education you could ever get, because you see how all these different peoples live. I mean, well, to give you an example, we used to go back in the 60s, we went into all those Middle East countries over there. Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of them. Iran and Iraq too. I will say one thing, the minute you got off the airplane over there in one of the Middle East countries, you could feel the tension, believe me, because that's a touchy deal over there. Right now it's really touchy, but back then it wasn't quite as bad as it is now until Nasser tried to run the Israelis out of there, and that backfired on him.
So, with your crew, did you assist in any major battles, any small battles that were fought?
Now, see, we're a support group. The only time we got where somebody shot at us was over in Vietnam. Over at Da Nang one night, we were in a mortar attack because we had to stay there overnight. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, the VC did a mortar attack. See what they were after. There was a huge detachment with the United States Army, the 1st Air Cavalry Division. Well, they had all these choppers down there on the south end of that base. And that's what they were after. They hated those gunships, helicopters, because they were so mobile. And up at Pleiku, they shot at us. As a matter of fact, this airplane right here, 2008, that's a C-133. This dude right here, that's the one that's in the Air Force Museum.
Thank you.
Matter of fact, I was the last guy to work on that dude the day we sent her to the museum.
Wow.
And up here on the tail of this, you can't see it because the wing blocks it out of that picture.
Yeah.
But there's eight 37 millimeter bullet holes in that sucker. We'd coming out of Pleiku one day, and they had an anti-aircraft site set up about 2.5 miles off the end of that runway. So when you went in there, you made a max jet penetration landing, and then when you come out, you hung around the props, and you clumb out, and we was passing through about 10,000 feet, and it went boom, 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 like that. And Lieutenant Pike was the pilot that day. You had to know him to appreciate this. But he turned around and looked at me and he says, because I was a flying crew chief on that airplane at that day, or on that trip. And he looked at me and he said, "Folks, what was that?" And I said, "I think we just got our tail feathers shot off." And he says, "Really?" I said, "Can I use the sextant for a minute?" Well, the sextant's up in the roof of the cockpit of that airplane. And if you know how to use it, you can use it like a periscope, and you can look at the leading edge of the tail on that airplane. And I looked back there and I could see some holes right behind the de-icer boot of it. And I says, "I think you better depressurize this thing and let me go back and go up in the hellhole there up in the tail, make sure they didn't hit nothing serious, you know," which we got lucky. They didn't hit no hydraulic lines or cables or nothing. Did knock one radio antenna out, but other than that. But I remember I took Dan, well, I took the kids out there once to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, and I walked up to this airplane sitting on the ramp out there, and I know where them holes was. They've all been patched. I mean, if you didn't know what had happened, you'd never see it, but I know where they're at. And I remember I walked up to that airplane and I put my ear up against the fuselage, and my son Dan says to me, "What are you doing, Dad?" I said, "I'm checking for the heartbeat." I said, "This old girl, she was the high-time bird of the fleet. She was the queen of the fleet." And I said, "Every one of these airplanes had a heartbeat all their own." And I said, "After you worked on them a while, you learned that. Every one of them had a personality." I don't know how to, I know that sounds crazy, but it ain't. Believe me. And the 124s were the same way. I got lucky. The two 124s that I crewed while I was up there were both really good aircraft.
So, this might sound like a weird question, but what was it like in shot at when you were flying?
Well, it'll get your attention. It'll scare you a little bit. You gotta be nuts if you ain't scared a little bit. I think the mortar attack down at Da Nang scared me more though than when we got shot at coming out of Pleiku. See, Pleiku was right up real close to the DMZ, where the North and South were divided, North and South Vietnam. And you flew down this river, and that river made a bend, and Pleiku Air Force Base was right where that bend was. And of course, that was so close to North Vietnam that it was easy for them dudes to set up an anti-aircraft site out there. And everybody knew about it. Everybody that flew into that joint knew about it. And, you know, it was just one of them things.
Okay. So when you weren't, so you were a jet specialist, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you have any other jobs on the base?
Well, yeah, on these two airplanes and the C-141, I worked the longest on this one, the 133. I worked the biggest share of about 10 years on this airplane altogether. But also, the 141, the C5, the 141 I worked on about 8 years on it. And then the C5 I worked about 4 years on it. And at one time, I was one of the few guys on that base out there that was triple qualified. Because I was qualified as a run man on the 141, the 133, and the C5 all at the same time. And you had to be a pretty sharp cookie to keep all that straight, man. Because I'll never forget when I first got to Dover and I walked up inside this big dude here, the 133, and the cockpit in that thing. You know, you got all these gauges up here between the pilot and co-pilot. There's 7 rows, 4 gauges in each row, 1 for each engine. And you look at that, and then back here on the engineer's panel, you got all the whole fuel system of the airplane, the anti-ice system, the bleed air system, the whole 9 yards the engineer takes care of. And I sat there and looked at all those gauges and switches and circuit breakers and you name it, and I thought, good Lord, I'll never learn this. But you know what? I did. I could go back out. Now there's one down at Grand Tool right now. In fact, it's the sister ship of this one. This is 2008. The one at Grand Tool's 2009. One of my best friends was a crew chief on that airplane at one time. I'd go down there right now, climbing that cockpit, and if all the stuff was still in that airplane, I could start it up and run it. I know I could. Because I don't think I'll ever forget how to do it.
All right. So what was it like flying those huge planes?
Well, I didn't fly it. I just worked on it. Now, I will have to admit that I spent a couple times. They let me sit in the pilot seat on the 133 and on the 141 both. And the 141 was a fabulous airplane. It was the best one I ever worked on. That thing, if you did the scheduled maintenance like you were supposed to, didn't cheat on nothing, you could just fly that airplane forever and nothing go wrong with it. The 141 was a super aircraft. Even after they stretched them out, you know, after we had them, when was that, it was in the 70s. And they added they stretched that airplane out, made it 28 feet longer. They put a section in front of the wing and then another section behind the wing, and they made the airplane bigger because it was so overpowered. it had 4 big Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines on it. And that thing was like a flying pogo stick. I mean, it really was. It was amazing what that thing, we had this one pilot out there, he was a test hop pilot. And I went on some test hops with him. And of course, when you fly a test hop, there ain't no load on the airplane. All you got's a minimum fuel load. And of course, that thing's pretty light, you know. And he could make that thing go like a fighter plane. He could do everything but roll it. You can't do that. You can't roll it because of the T-tail. You'd rip it off if you did that. But see that's a 141 right there. That gray dude, that's a C-141.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
And that is a fabulous airplane. Matter of fact, all 4 of the big ones that I worked on, that's a C5.
Okay.
That one there.
Yeah.
This big T-tail dude here. That's the 133.
All right.
And that's the 124.
Okay.
And that's the 141.
All right.
And the 141, pound for pound, was the best one I ever worked on. It had a fabulous engine on it. They hung that engine on just about anything you can name. The airlines used them. It's called a TF-33, Pratt & Whitney TF-33. It's a 2-stage turbofan up in the front. And it put out, on the 141 we were cranking about, at max power we'd crank out about 22,000 pounds of thrust apiece out of each engine. And some of the airlines would take that same engine and they put different burner cans in them and a bigger supplied fuel control, and they get it up 40,000 pounds coming out of that dude, which you got quite a fire lit in her if you're putting that much out of her. But anyway, it was such a reliable engine if you took care of it. It really was. You hardly ever had anything go wrong with that dude. Except if you, now one night, see Dover Air Force Base, the big Delaware Bay is right off the end of the runway out there. And one night in the fall one time, a guy flew into a flock of geese out there. And he wiped 2 engines out on that dude. And the one engine, when he landed, and he finally got that thing taxied in on the spot, you could look straight through it. I mean, it wiped the whole guts of that engine out. And that was the worst one I ever saw. And I mean, we dug goose guts out of everything on those 2 engines. I mean, now the other one was screwed up too, but it wasn't screwed up near as bad. But I'll never forget that. And that crew, they got out and kissed the ground because they thought they were dead for a little bit when that thing blew, man. I'll never forget that one either. But, it was, like I say, some of it I wouldn't do it again if they asked me. And then some of it I wouldn't give $1 million for the education I got out of it. I mean, you kind of you learn what people in other parts of the world think and how they operate. You get to where you understand it a little better. I will say that. At least it did that for me anyway. Now, I don't know whether it affects everybody that way. Most of the guys that I served with, I think it affected them that way. I've got 2 or 3 real good buddies that I served with that we still, you know, we're almost like brothers, you know. In fact, Dave Featherston down there in Florida, he's the closest thing to a brother I ever had when I was in the Air Force. We worked together for 8 years. We were what they call a red ball team. And whenever an airplane was out there getting ready to block out on a mission and something went wrong with the engines, guess who they called? Dave and me. And we played beat the clock so many times out there, it was ridiculous. And we were pretty good at it. And I remember we had an assistant line chief out there, his name was Sergeant Lamb. And we went out there and saved 2 hot ones for him in one day. And we went back in the shop there. We were working day shift at that time. And we got back in the shop there going on 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I had a ton of paperwork to do. Anyway, phone rang and the guy on the dispatch desk hollered at me. He says, "Hey, somebody wants to talk to you folks." I said, "All right." So I didn't know who it was. And I answered it and he said, "This is Sergeant Lamb." He says, "What are you and Featherston doing when you get off work today?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "We got a ton of paperwork to do here," but I said, "Once we get done with that, Dave walked in about that time. He was back in the restroom, and he come in there, and I said, "Are you going to be free for a little bit right after work?" And he said, "Yeah, what's the problem?" And I said, "I don't know what the problem is." But I said, "Sergeant Lamb wants to talk to us." And he said, "Uh-oh." Well, you know, when an assistant line chief calls you up, you think, "What'd I screw up now?" You know? So anyway, he says, "I'll tell you what, I'll meet you down at the NCO club. Whenever you get off work, I'll be there waiting for you." So we did. After we got off, got all our paperwork done, everything turned in, went down to the NCO club, walked in there, and yeah, there he was. And Dave looked at me kind of funny, you know, like, "Man, what are we getting into now?" And we walked over there and sat down, and we were both kind of apprehensive about this, because, you know, when you get up there, a guy that got 9 stripes on his shoulder, he's one of the head honchos out there, you know. And I thought, I wonder what this is all about. And we sat down there, and he poured us a beer, and he says, "How long you 2 guys been working together?" At that time, we sat there and thought a little bit, and Dave says, "Well, we've been working together about 7 years." And Sergeant Lamb says, "I figured you guys have been together quite a while." He says, "I guess you're wondering why I called you down here." And I looked at Dave and I said, "Yeah, we're kind of wondering if something's wrong, you know." And he says, "You know," he says, I was in SAC for 25 years, Strategic Air Command, B-52s, B-47s. And he says, "I thought I'd seen some of the best red ball teams on earth when I was in SAC. But," he says, "you 2 guys cake the cake." He says, "I've never seen guys know what they're doing like you guys do and hustle." He says, "You guys hustle like you're playing a ball game or something." And I said, "Well," I said, "that kind of comes from Jack Chambers, who was the line chief. He was Lamb's boss, see? And of course, David made work for him for all the time we'd been at Dover practically. And Jack, his favorite saying, if he knew that we were on duty, if they had a hot one that was screwed up out there, and it was an engine or a prop or whatever, get Foes and Featherston out here. And that got kind of monotonous, to be honest about it, because we got called for just about everything under the sun, you know. But Jack Chambers was one of the finest men I ever worked for. He really was.
Okay.
But oh, it got pretty exciting. I think the biggest challenge of the whole thing was the technical aspect that you were getting into. Because I remember when I was in high school, you know, I studied algebra, geometry, physics, and you know, you get kind of, man, will I ever use this? You know what? When I got to working on them jet engines, I used all that stuff. Because that all come into meaning. You used all these different formulas to figure out torque values and thrust ratios and all this stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons I got along in tech school so good, was because I had a good background, especially math. Because I liked math, and I was pretty good at it when I was in high school. I'm sure glad I studied it pretty good, because I sure did have to use it.
Yeah. So, were you, how did you stay in contact with any family who wasn't with you in Dover?
Run that by me again now.
How did you stay in contact with any family members who weren't in Dover with you?
Oh, we used to write them letters back and forth, talk to them on the telephone, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we stayed in contact with Mildred's folks, which is my wife, and my folks, and every once in a while I'd even get a hold of my brother and sister just to see if they were still kicking, you know. And she'd do the same thing with her family. And we usually would get back here once, maybe every year and a half, something like that, for a leave, which wasn't too bad. It really, I mean, I'll have to admit that some of the hours that we put in were crazy. I remember when we were on that big TDY out at Travis, we had 13 of our C-133s. See, Travis had 133s also. And we had 13 of the big mothers from Dover. And we only had 4 engine men out there to take care of 13 airplanes. And every once in a while, when 7 or 8 of them would come in there at the same time, that got pretty squirrely. And we worked 48 hours on and 48 hours off. And that got to be a long haul. You'd get some, when you got done with your shift, because see, we split our teams up with two teams, 2 guys on each team, and that was the best way to try to cover them. See? And we did it. we made them go.
Did you get married to Grandma Foes while you were in the military?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. So, what were some of the things you did when you were off duty?
Oh, well, we used to go out for supper with friends and stuff. I used to play squadron football, squadron baseball, and you know, a lot of stuff like that. You know, our neighbors where we lived at, we used to go out with them.
What year did you get out of full service, so you weren't in the reserves, you weren't active duty? Or
I left out there at Dover and came back here and went farming in September 1st, 1973.
Alright. So, how did you readjust to like working on the farm and not being in the military?
Well, it really wasn't that bad for me, because I knew what farming was all about, until I went into the service, that's all I'd ever done, you know, as far as work goes. And one thing, I was lucky, my dad taught me hard work. And the work never bothered me. Now, I think it bothered Grandma more than it bothered me. It took her a while to get adjusted to the pace, because the spring and the fall when you're farming is like a nut house, because that's the two most critical times of the year for a farmer, because spring you're planting season, and of course you're at the mercy of the weather, and in the same way in the fall during harvest you're at the mercy of the weather again. So when it's time to go get it, you got to get after it and stay after it. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And she had kind of a hard time adapting to some. Now, we put in some pretty wild hours in the spring and the fall, especially in the fall. We'd go from 5 o'clock in the morning till after midnight every day, you know, because you have to babysit that corn dryer, and there's a lot of, you know, you'd work all day picking corn, combining beans, whatever, but somebody had to watch that corn dryer at night, because that wet holding bin be sitting there chock full of corn. You had to get that out of there, or you didn't have no room to go the next day, see? So that got interesting. We used to do that in shifts. We'd take turns, because my two brother-in-laws were my partners in this deal, and we worked that out pretty good.
Alright. Okay, so you said you've remained in contact with a few of your, let me rephrase this. Have you remained in contact with any of your crew from when you were serving?
You mean guys I worked with in the Air Force? Yeah. Yeah, probably all total, maybe 6 or 7 of them.
Alright.
And yeah, that's about right.
Are you part of any veterans organizations, like the VA?
No.
Alright.
Yeah, yeah, technically I'm part of the veterans organization.
Alright. How did your experiences in the military affect you?
Oh, it made me appreciate things. I can tell you that, because you see how some of these other people have to live in other parts of the world, and we are so lucky. Believe me, people that live in this country don't know how lucky they are. Believe me, I don't care whether you're talking Canada, Australia, England. You get down in some of these Central American countries, for example, man, and India, back in the 60s, India was one of the most poverty-ridden places you've ever seen. We flew supplies in there. They had a huge flood there. It was in, I forget the exact year, but it was in the later 60s. And all those big rivers that run through India went nuts. They got all kinds of rain down there, and the Ganges, I forget what the other two are called, but they all flooded. And most of their population is along those rivers. And of course, there was tremendous amount of people died in that deal. And that was possibly the worst catastrophe I ever saw. I could tell you stories about that that curl your hair. I know one time down in Nicaragua, they had an earthquake down there in the Managua area. And we flew relief in there, UN relief, you know, Red Cross and stuff. And that wasn't no picnic either. The toll it took in lives was unbelievable. Of course, part of that is what their buildings are made out of down there. See, most of it's adobe brick. Well, adobe brick ain't very strong. And when a big shaker like that earthquake they had down there, and it was a dilly, man, that was terrible. It really was. But if nothing else, seeing what I saw made me really appreciate what we had here. Believe me.
Okay. So you learned to appreciate things. Are there any other lessons you learned from being in the military?
Oh yeah, how to treat people, how to get along with people, how to take orders, give orders. I learned a lot of that. I was real lucky. I had some really good supervisors. Well, as a matter of fact, one of my best friends, old George, that lives down there in North Carolina now, he was probably one of the best supervisors I ever worked for. And he was from Hershey, Pennsylvania. He's a Dutchman. And he's as stubborn as a Missouri mule. But the one thing that he taught us guys that worked for him, he says, when you go out and work on one of these big mothers, he said, don't ever walk away from it unless you're willing to get in it and go with it. And you know what? It's a good way to do it. You'll never get in trouble that way. But I had a real good crew chief when I was in the 124s, old Bob Phillips. He knew that airplane forward and backward. And I learned a lot from that guy. He was a good man.
All right. Okay. Is there a message you would want to leave for anyone who might see this interview? Like,
for anyone that would what?
Who would view this, who could see her, who will watch this interview?
Oh, I don't know. Now, I know a lot of guys are kind of afraid of the military, but there really ain't no reason to be afraid of it. Personally, I think it was it's a good growing experience. It'll, like I said, it'll learn you to appreciate things. Even when you got times when you think, boy, the world's against me, hey man, there's always some other poor devil that's in a lot worse shape than you are. Believe me, that's a fact. The thing that used to bug me the most was when I'd go to some of these places and the little kids, there's some of them little kids didn't have a fighting chance in hell, man. It was sad to watch. But I think overall it's a good place to learn about life, be honest about it. I don't know really how else to put it. Like I say, parts of it I wouldn't want to go through again, but then on the other hand, I wouldn't take $1 million for the education I got. In fact, you probably couldn't get that education for $1 million, because you're going to see a little bit of everything. That's pretty much it.
All right, and that's it for me. So thank you for taking time out of your day for this interview
Oh, that's okay.
and for serving our country.
Well,